What advice would you generally provide to an organization that is transitioning from being fiscally sponsored to becoming an independent nonprofit organization? Michael, give a few thoughts to set it up
Sure.
first. It's a broad
Yep.
question, so there could be lots of different pieces of advice I would give. But I think maybe what this is getting at is a little bit about what is the process.
Yep.
So, an organization that is fiscally sponsored, typically that will be, as we've explained in other pieces and videos, that'll be a Model A or Model B, often, where you're under the umbrella of the fiscal sponsor. And then, after a certain period of time, make the decision that we want to form and be our own organization and pursue 501c3 status. Although it's also common for this to be Model C, where you already have a corporation, an entity formed, and then you want to branch out and get 501c3 status for that entity. So I think number one thing that jumps out to me is keeping in mind the timing. You've got the fiscal sponsor now, you're transitioning to getting your own 501c3 status, but you're still going to need that fiscal sponsor until that is in hand, approved by the IRS, and you're ready to let go. So I would say keep that in mind, the timing. I mean, that's really up in the air these days, but used to be pretty reliably 6 months of turnaround time from the IRS. It could be quite a bit longer than that right now, and even the 6 months could vary. So we really don't know, but build in a conservative, healthy projection as to how long this might take. Number one, I think you're also thinking about, what is in our fiscal sponsor agreement? How do we address things like terminating the agreement, transitioning the funds? Does it say anything about if you go off and form an organization, or does it talk about successor organizations? What is the process there? I think first thing I would look at is what is that language and what are we working with? How much notice do we need to provide? What kind of fiscal sponsor permissions do we need to get? What standard are they under? Is it like at their sole discretion whether to transition the money or not? Or is it as long as you've got 501c3 status, they basically cannot unreasonably deny, a requested transfer. There's issues like that to sort out. So I would say number one, timing. Number two, think about transition language that's in the fiscal sponsor agreement. And I probably have more thoughts, but Mike, what jumps out to you from that
Yeah,
process
Ben.
so far?
From a checklist perspective, I definitely go to your there first. Like, what is the compliance around it?
Mm-hmm.
Just to make sure that you don't have a sort of a tripping, because there's something in the agreements that you need to be aware of.
Yeah.
The,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
second thing that I might add to you that might help a little bit, coming up from a financial CFO perspective, is I try to view it over as it lines up with the fiscal year of your entity and be aware of usually you'll line up the fiscal year
Mm-hmm.
of the other entity and assume
Yeah.
it's going to affect 3 budget years.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I look at it is, budget year number one is sort of the planning, everything's going along. Then you have the transition budget. And then for the organization exiting, what does their budget when they look like standalone? And that helps you to get like the
Right.
pieces in place and things that you've been leaning on and such. The
Mm-hmm.
last one is me, Ben. I always worry about the perception of these things, and that advanced planning, although it might have nothing to do with compliance, is getting the message out. How do we want to do
Mm-hmm.
this? Because more than not, a lot of these exiting these agreements end up looking like divorces that were not positive versus it
Right.
can also be a celebration. This organization helped us get started. It was a great thing. We're
Yeah.
now getting ready to graduate, or, however you want to
Mm-hmm.
paint the picture. And giving everybody that extra time to think about it, because the organization you're working with, looking at it from the entity that will be pulling out, I think it's more planning on their part. There's some planning on the other.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is what's the tone? What's the message? And if there is any tripping hazards, there's nothing bad that happens usually out of starting the discussion early. Now,
Yeah.
sometimes I've heard from more than one or two nonprofits where they said, if I put the question on the table too early, they might want to pull the agreement sooner, or get
Right.
disillusioned that it's going to disappear. So again, you got to get back to that.
Okay.
But I think
Yeah.
the 3 cycle one is very important. Where are we at?
Hmm.
What's that transition period look like, and what are we planning for? How are we going to be? Which a lot of the elements you talked about were in there.
Right. Yeah, and a couple other follow-up thoughts. It's worth keeping in mind that, like you were implying, Mike, the relationship is really important. And one of the reasons that's important, just getting down to brass tacks, as a fiscally sponsored organization, you do not have a ton of power in the situation generally. The fiscal sponsor agreement is normally going to be structured in a way that gives a lot of discretion and control to the fiscal sponsor because, as we've talked about, that's a necessary part of making that work. So they're going to be in a lot of control over what to do during the transition, and it might be up to them. Do they really cooperate and help you make it seamless, or do they rake you over the coals over every little issue? So the relationship there is very important to making sure that goes smoothly.
The one negative that seems to come out in these fiscal sponsorship relationships, there's a revenue stream to
Right.
the entity providing the services. And sometimes they're either one of two spots, either happy this is finally ending, or they've really
Yeah.
become to rely on that stream of revenue.
Yeah.
And so I'll just leave it at that. Nothing that having extra time isn't important for, but
Hmm.
I've seen that on more than a few occasions.
Right. Right. So yeah, just navigating the dynamics of the relationship is tricky. And I'll close with saying a lot of the considerations just are kind of things that anybody starting a new organization would need to consider. Okay, you're incorporating for the first time. Who's on your board? What are your governing documents? How are you describing the organization and your plans to the IRS in the application for 501c3 status? So all of that is just as applicable here. You may have a bit of a leg up because you've been doing the program for a while and hopefully it's been successful, but you're needing to think about all those fundamental issues. And we've got a checklist on the site about steps to starting a new nonprofit organization. So many of those will be just as applicable.
Right. And Ben, you can't afford to make a mistake on either side. You got to have all the, all your applications in process, business licenses, make sure, because when you're talking to
Yeah.
donors, all of a sudden you don't want them to think like there's something with their contribution. And on the other side, you
Right,
got to
right.
be totally aware of the perceptions, the messaging to the general public. So I don't know if
Hmm.
you have to, I think you got to favor both at the same time to be aware of them. And that's the advanced planning of using a 3 cycle
Right, right, right.
approach.
And part of that advanced planning, understand that your organization will now be responsible for all the compliance things that the fiscal sponsor maybe was taking care of,
Exactly.
charitable solicitation registrations,
Exactly.
etc. So all that needs to be factored into the planning.